Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe for CityTalk from the Canadian Urban Institute. Welcome to this CityTalk, which we're broadcasting live from the Art of City Building Conference, which is taking place as we speak about 50 meters over to my right in a theater here in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, across the river from Halifax, all part of the Halifax Regional Municipality. Really pleased to be having so many people join us, and also because we did the time change, because we're on Atlantic time here. So thanks for those of you in the West who got up a bit earlier than you're used to. We're really looking forward to having a really constructive conversation this morning, and or this, in your case, early this morning. I'm going to ask my panelists to put their cameras on, and we had to quickly pivot, as they say, using the common vernacular from COVID. We had to pivot to going online solely because we had hoped to be able to be physically in the theater together, but we've had to, this is one of the good things about COVID, I guess, right? Is that we know how to go electronically when we can. And so that's what we've done. And so we're now all joining us virtually, even though we actually are in physical proximity, with the exception of Sarah, who is coming in from Calgary. The HRM, as Halifax is affectionately called, is located here in it's the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq and the traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. And we've just had a whole morning of orientation and serious conversation about what reconciliation really needs to look like. What does that look like in practice? How do we come to terms with all the varying understandings that people have, and the various agreements that exist, unceded, ceded, in this case, all fully unceded. And HRM acknowledges the peace and friendship treaties that have been signed in the territory. But I think what I would take from the last 3 hours of discussion here is that we've still got a ways to go. And those of us in the placemaking world can throw terms off quickly. We're all treaty people, and that's not always received as being sensitive or respectful or acknowledging the deep history that we have here and the unacknowledged effects of that continue to live on. And kids aren't educated about this, and we're all slowly coming to terms with this. The other important piece about the history here is the deep attachment of the African Nova Scotian community to various neighborhoods that are, some of which are encompassed in HRM and some of which aren't, and all of that process of reconciliation and what that looks like. So these are all topics that are being talked about in and out of these sessions here at the Art of City Building. So if you weren't tuned in this morning to any of the Art of City Building sessions, by all means, tune in this afternoon. I think it's on Facebook Live in the Inspiring Communities page, or just Google Art of City Building 2023, and I think it'll direct you to where you can go to at least watch the remaining sessions that will take place after this. And also, I'm sure they're captured. It's all being recorded and captured, and so it'll be posted subsequently. So we were very happy to be able to do a CityTalk in conjunction with this convening, and we'll be doing the same kind of thing a month from now in Toronto, when Evergreen hosts and Future Cities host their conference on city building as well. So we'll look forward to doing a live CityTalk from there as well. Anyway, joining me here in HRM is Osa Katrin, who tells me she's just across the road here. She said to me 5 minutes ago, you could just run across the street and I could have you in an office here. Sue Utek, who also is the head of the library system here in HRM. Sue, who's the CEO of the Spring Garden Business Improvement Area, and she, I think, it looks like you're in a bathroom, Sue, or a shower. I can't tell where you are. You're in a dress. You're just down the corridor from me here at Alderley Landing. Bill, over to you. Bill, it works for the HRM. He also was to be here, but he's, I think, safely ensconced in his office. Am I right, Bill? Are you at City Hall?
Correct. I'm at City Hall in Halifax, Grand Parade.
Yeah, great. Nice to see you there. And Sarah, you're coming into us from Calgary. How are things in Calgary?
They're good. It's a beautiful fall morning here. Lovely to be with you.
So the way we normally start City Talks is we ask people to give us off the top what they're seeing, what's working, what's not, and what's next. And we're all here talking about social infrastructure, civic infrastructure, and what that looks like, and how does it particularly affect the social determinants of health and economic inclusion. So I might start, because we've got so many Haligonians here, I'm going to start probably with you, Bill, because you are literally at ground zero. I walked across the green space in front of City Hall this morning, so I saw some of the reality of what you're dealing with. So can you just remember, you've got a national audience here. Can you just give people a sense of what you're seeing on the ground and your purview about that, about what's working and what's not right this minute in terms of civic social infrastructure. Over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mary, and thanks for the opportunity. So the windows behind me here, you're correct. If I was to open those screens, you'd look outside and see somewhere around about 18 tents, maybe a few less after we just had a hurricane blow through here over the last 24, 36 hours. A number of those tents were badly damaged, and there are people out there in various stages of trying to rebuild the lives that they're living in those tents. If you were to go about 3-4 blocks from here, there's another small civic park located in a very, I would call it a beautiful and somewhat affluent part of the city that is basically a tent city, upwards of 35 tents in that space. We are not unlike a lot of places across North America and Canada that are experiencing increased levels of homelessness. Some say we're at a slight disadvantage in the fact that Halifax is booming. It is one of the best places to live and people are flocking here. The unfortunate part of it, it has driven our vacancy rate down to below 1% and has caused the cost of living in homes to increase. And as a result of that has put some in the rental industry in the position of either rent evicting, going to short-term leases to allow for increases in costing. And the net effect is the increase in those who are experiencing homelessness. There are over 1,000 people on the by name list here in Halifax. Those are looking for housing, and I was told that there's approximately 30,000 people that are at risk of potentially becoming homeless due to the economic situation and the housing situation. So just to kind of lay the framework, I'm the Executive Director of Community Safety. It's a new business unit. It was struck in March of this year after our new Chief Administrative Officer came on board. In my business unit, they pulled housing and homelessness, the Emergency Management Office, I should know these as my business unit, compliance, public safety office, the Street Navigator program, and food security, all into one business unit. And what we're beginning to do as a result of a number of reports that have gone to City Council over the last number of years, starting to reimagine services provided by the municipality and reimagining the way those services are delivered and by whom. There's been a push to move some of those services historically being delivered by police to a non-police response. So we're in the beginning of starting to work through those new modalities, if you will. We have a very strong homelessness outreach team, was added to in the recent budget. We're starting to mobilize more community-based groups. And we're starting to see some synergies between those portions of our business and city that were not, they were working, but I would characterize it to a degree working in siloed approach. And we're looking at a much more broadened, a comprehensive approach, working with the libraries, working with community groups to try to look at some of the issues. And, you know, and I think the kind of the big four that keep coming back to me that have an intersection with what we're discussing here are issues around crime, homelessness, mental health, and addictions, and how all those four are playing together to form what we're seeing today, day in, day out. In Nova Scotia, health and homelessness is a provincial responsibility. We're not passing the buck, but it does bring another level of coordination required to bring our provincial partners to the table. And I will say that they have been very, very active in the discussion around those pieces. So that's really what we're seeing here now. You know, we had a very intense and the most emotional city council meeting I've ever attended, quite frankly, last Tuesday night, talking about our response to those that are experiencing homelessness and trying to find some empathetic and equity-based approaches to dealing with these individuals. And you know, I think it's fair to say, and then we do address it, that I think there's a stigma associated with those that are experiencing homelessness, that somehow that's their responsibility, that they're there and the like. And I can tell you that, and from the people that I talk to in a day, and the face of homelessness is varied. There are a lot of different people that are experiencing homelessness for a lot of different reasons. And not to say that any one of them is better than the other, but it is not a singularly driven or a singular type of person that is experiencing this. And as a result of that, we've had to have some discussions around our solutions need to be responsive to those individuals. And a one-size-fit-all approach does not work. And I would even suggest that a one-size could actually put some of our most vulnerable populations in a more precarious position if we don't understand the requirements and the needs that they have to have. So all that to say is, do we have all the answers? No. But with the city, I will applaud the city in the fact that they've realized that trying to deal with these new emerging issues with a framework and structure from the past was not the appropriate approach. So I applaud them for taking the bold step of changing the structure. And now it's up to us to really mobilize those pieces to try to bring the level of supports and services to bear. And hopefully with doing that, we're going to have a multifold, our impact will be broad. Number one, for those that are in need, hopefully they're having a better outcome. But I think number two, that actually has a broader community benefit and then a business benefit for our downtowns and our main streets. And because I think that they're taking the brunt, I think, of a lot of what we're seeing here. And so with that, I'll stop my comments here, but I'm certainly able to speak more of it as we go along.
You know, as you say, this is about people. You know, everyone that we're experiencing. We have an American colleague who's speaking here, and he was in Toronto for the day before. He's from New York. He was in Tim Tompkins. He was in Toronto for a day trying to get into the Atlantic region because of the storm. And he said to me last night, he was just shocked by the numbers of people that need support that were visible on the street in Toronto and that he experiences in New York and that we're seeing in other cities. And we just forget it's about people. And as you suggest, no one situation is the same. And how do we have an empathic response to the circumstances? As you say, there's tons of stigma. And at the same time, it's also having an impact on other people who enjoy public space, want to be able to take their children there, or people operating businesses on main streets. I'm going to ask Sue to join and talk a bit about that, because it has so many ripple effects. And I was thinking that, thank you everybody that's coming in on the chat. We appreciate people identifying where they're coming in from. And as you know, this chat is CityTalk chats are typically very active. So feel free to volley questions out there and answer each other's questions. We always publish the chat, the transcript, because people put in really important resources. So I hope you'll all continue to do that. And we also have people coming in, I can see, from across the country in varying different circumstances. And what's always so striking to me about these challenges is how shared they are, and that cities are all having them in different ways, but some common threads. And I think last week I was in Ottawa. Bill and I actually were in Ottawa together a few weeks ago, talking with a bunch of deputy ministers and city managers across the country, staff people, trying to explain to senior federal bureaucrats what the challenge looks like on the street, on the ground. I was last week at the Institute for Public Administration conference and struck by how well-intentioned so many of, I'm assuming all the public service is, but also being aware the distance between people writing federal policy or even provincial policy, the distance from them to what someone like you, Sue, is seeing on the ground. So let's hear from you a little bit about what your perspective is and how your BAA has been trying to address this. And I'm sure a lot of it will mirror what Bill has just said. So happy to have you, and knock 3 times on the wall, and that's me on the other side of the wall.
Oh, thanks, Mary. And thanks everyone for sitting in today. I'm Sue Utek. I'm the Executive Director for the Spring Garden Area Business Association. So we consider ourselves the heart of Halifax. We're 4 city blocks. We're encompassed. I'm on to the end of the 4 city blocks is my counterpart, Paul McKinnon of the downtown. And to the north, where Bill Moore had talked about, we have this beautiful Victorian Park, and it's across the road from the Halifax Public Gardens, which is the oldest public gardens in North America. So for us right now, you know, this is tourist season. We have an encampment that has grown steadily, alarmingly over the last 2 years. So, we're business associations. We're in a position of advocacy, but we're also in beautification events, etc. So for us, the real life lived experience on the ground is we've had to cancel events because we can't use Victoria Park. So events simply got canceled this year. From a shopkeeper's point of view, theft, vandalism, the mental health issues on the street, fentanyl is here. It's in Halifax. It's alive and well. So it could be everything from just the mental health crisis, fentanyl on the street, the stark reality of we don't have enough washrooms here. So people are just going where they need to go. And a lot of shopkeepers now at this point, everyone has empathy and nobody wants anyone living in this situation. But businesses right now, with the CEBA loans due, all of that stuff, they are just maxed. They're exhausted, there's the lack of help, etc. To deal with this issue. So we deal with it directly on the ground. And one of the ways we have as Bill had alluded to, a navigator outreach program that's been in existence since 2007. So basically your navigator is a social worker that visits people on the street and looks to see what services that they need. The navigator can do anything from, trying to help to stop eviction, whether it's like you're in arrears with payment, try and find job, get boots, tents on the ground, all of this stuff. And the irony of it is, as Bill had said, this is a municipal government that's not in the trade of housing, which is now in the business of homelessness. So we have this real disconnect. I'm starting to see improvement. And I think one of the positives is there's having Bill Moore in the Office of Public Safety, very keen to listen to us as business improvement districts. But overall, it's a reputation that suffers when you can't publicly come out constantly and say, we have a crisis here, we have a crisis, because people will no longer come to the downtown and they won't want to live here. And we've had an unprecedented building boom in the Spring Garden area where we now have residents that are like, what can we do? It's not about the NIMBY. Yes, this is a wealthy area. It's they don't want to see this situation. So, we're finding on the ground here in Halifax, the cooperation between the levels of government is not where it was supposed to be. And I think, Bill again alluded to this very emotional council meeting, because this problem has been thrust upon the municipality, which has now been thrust upon the business improvement districts. So the reputational hit to the area, it's not a good look to have these tents. It's not a good look to have 14 people panhandling in one city block or sleeping on a bench. And fentanyl is here. What do we do with the issue of fentanyl? And I know that us at the Halifax Public Library, this is a day-to-day crisis, because of the library, as she'll speak to, is like the post of last resort. We don't have enough shelters. We don't have enough beds. We've had too much of a concentration of services, to my colleague Tracy in the North End. So this has all been combined for the perfect storm. And if you'd had to be out on Saturday, which I wanted to check on the encampment, it broke your heart to see tents blowing across the street, people just standing there going, where do I go and what do I do now? Because businesses had shut down, right? We're closed for the day. I can't even get a cup of tea somewhere. So, it's the day-to-day, the daily issues on the street, the business fatigue, and it's just at the perfect storm right now.
Literally the perfect storm, eh? I mean, literally and figuratively. It's, I always remind people that none of us can only do one thing anymore. You can't just say, oh, I'm a shopkeeper, or I'm a that. We're all in this somehow. We all have to. And during the pandemic, I feel like we lost some of that, certainly in government, we lost some of that jurisdictional nonsense. Oh, this isn't my jurisdiction. It's, now during the pandemic, everybody had to help. We all had to figure this out. And that's, I think, part of the adjustment we're facing is that now the urgency of the pandemic has passed. But as you suggest, we're like dealing with a whole bunch of other perfect storms coming together. And we have to get back to that kind of mutual solution finding. I've been interested to see with the discourse around housing, for instance, as you suggest, in Nova Scotia, housing is a provincial responsibility, but HRM has had to assume all sorts of aspects of it because nobody else was doing it. And then you start to see people retrenching. The Prime Minister even said it's not our responsibility. And, you know, a lot of people responded very negatively to that and said, are you kidding? So I think this notion of how do we always be pushing up, metaphorically, to the province and the federal government, a better awareness of what's actually occurring. And as you suggest, Sue, you're dealing with shopkeepers, business owners, and who don't normally have access to policymakers at the provincial or federal level, right? They're busy, you know, making the living, doing whatever they're doing. So this is all part of our ongoing effort here to kind of connect these dots so that people understand what matters. And I appreciate the efforts of your navigators and how do we get the feedback from navigators fed back up. So you're reinforcing what Bill is saying. It's about people and individuals. And the one anecdote I remember Bill saying to me a couple of weeks ago was that those tents, I don't know if it's true about the ones in the park that you're in Victoria that you're reflecting, but a lot of these people get up in the morning and go to work. Yes. So you can't make any assumptions about who's in a tent, right? And what their life circumstances.
Exactly. You know, nobody says that when they're in grade 7, my life goal is to be homeless. Right?
Yeah, of course.
Wake up and look at that every day and, you know, have some compassion.
Well, and also people rotate, you know, life circumstances change. And it's not that you may be homeless for a period of time, and then there are people that are chronically homeless and really need those kinds of supports. Okay, well, you just mentioned the library, so that's a cue. Yeah. Let's hear from you also first in terms of the local on the scene, what the HRM library system is coping with, and then we're going to go all the way to Calgary and hear from Sarah what her experience is. I should just say that CUI has been working closely with something called the Canadian Urban Libraries Council that OSA chairs, which is all the big libraries across the country. And in a couple of weeks, you're going to see a large report come out from us talking about what we've observed in libraries and what that means for the sustainability of the library systems across the country. That's just a little teaser to tell you that's coming because October is Libraries Month and we'll be on it. But we're really happy to have OSA and Sarah here as two. I was going to call you guys elder stateswomen of the library sector because you're kind of reflective of what I just described, that during the pandemic we all had to do everything and nothing is there's no more where true than in libraries. So also over to you in terms of what you're observing, and then Sarah will go to Calgary for you.
So certainly not to repeat Bill and Sue's concerns, we see every day the vulnerability that exists in our community, and it is different than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But what I would do is extend that vulnerability beyond those who are facing homelessness and who are most acutely vulnerable, because we have this financial strain that's happening. So there are those who lose housing, and then there are those who cannot afford housing, or where a great proportion of their income goes to house themselves. And we're also noticing an intergenerational impact from COVID. So our challenge is both in responding to the immediate, working closely with those community navigators, triaging members of our community who need tremendous support, and then also creating this institution that is going to have the effect on the next generation. So concurrent with that immediate response is also the care of families with young children, to really think about where are their literacy rates. We know, for example, literacy has an enormous impact on health outcomes and employability and school outcomes. And so it's an interesting challenge, because we're both providing that immediate reaction and immediate response. And then we're also trying to create that generational change through sort of sound practice. So thinking very much about belonging and social inclusion, and, you know, how do we address some of the polarization and that sort of dehumanizing of one another that we see in community. And really, we think about youth whose development was disrupted. So we have teenagers who might be 16 or 17 years old, and the size of 16 and 17-year-olds who missed a few years of socialization. And so their behavior might be more like a 12 or 13-year-old, and yet they're larger. So this sense so I would only extend that to say there are many people experiencing challenge. We've had a remarkable in-migration of people to Nova Scotia from other parts of Canada and other parts of the world. Those Nova Scotians who are on this call will remember likely the Ivany report, which came out about 12 years ago where Nova Scotia was going to wither up. We weren't going to have a tax base. We weren't going to be able to afford all the population growing older. And we desperately wanted people to come and stay, and they have come and they have stayed, and it's created different problems. But I think it's important to respond to the issue, but also say, okay, now how do we not just focus on responding, but acknowledge the shifts and look for longer term solutions rather than it has to happen both, right? Both have to sit side by side. And certainly libraries are really well positioned to do that. I am so grateful that we have our beautiful central library on Spring Garden Road. Sue talked about folks finding their way to us, and our ability to serve and serve with dignity and care is in part due to the amazing staff team that we have. Like I can't speak highly enough about the care that I see library staff providing every day, but it's also easier to do that in a building that's well designed with good sight lines, comfortable furnishing, enough space for folks to spread out so that we can have a senior who might live alone come and participate in a program alongside one of the most, one of our community's most vulnerable folks and a mom with a couple of toddlers arriving for a story time. So our libraries are genuinely at their best when they provide that service to all and that dignity to all, understanding that takes lots of effort and lots of finesse on the part of libraries.
Mm-hmm. And it's put enormous pressure on your staffs. We understand. We really can see
enormous.
that.
Yeah.
Enormous. I want everyone to just, in your spare time, I suspect that we've got people here who are very familiar, but if you haven't had a chance to Google images of Canada's libraries, public libraries, you will see remarkably, fabulously, beautifully designed spaces. So somewhere in there, we got that right. Sarah, put your camera on because I'm going to call on you next. And both you and Osa are in stunningly beautiful buildings. And I'm pleased about that. Like, that's a win. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves we've done some good things. Yeah. And one of the good things we did, I think, is come to recognize that these shared civic institutions deserve to be beautiful and and that there's a relationship between a really beautiful space and its a capacity to be a function, or as you just said, Osa, to feel like a home, to make people feel special. I feel so much at the moment as we're trying to navigate with people to encourage them to return to the city, like to re-establish their attachment to the place of the city, downtowns and main streets, and not just stay at your kitchen table. Is that part of it is that you're going to come into a physical space that's not like your home, that gives you something else. And both of you work in that kind of an environment. So hurrah to you that somehow we persuaded the powers that be to do that. Sarah, you did it though, really imaginatively, because you have to cobble together the resources and convince people that, oh yeah, let's put transit right underneath the library. And let's invest in a beautiful building. But you've also had all sorts of challenges. So give us a sense from your side, as the steward of a significant civic institution in Calgary, what do you see as your role in terms of contributing to the social determinants of health and economic inclusion? What's that look like for you?
For sure. Thanks, Mary, and lovely to see all of you. I'm Sarah Mueller, the CEO of Calgary Public Library, which is over in the West in Alberta, and we're a city of 1.3 million, and we are growing. 31,000 people moved from other provinces to Alberta in the first 3 months of 2023, and a large proportion of them came to Calgary. And we're seeing more and more folks come into the city, which is having an impact. There are, as you said, this amazing central library downtown. Many of you will know us for our central library. We've seen over 5 million visitors, and that is between 3,000 and 4,000 a day these days, which is a significant civic amenity that's providing all these services in a public space. And as we've talked about, there are great benefits to beautiful, amazing, welcoming public spaces, but there are also challenges along with it. So I'm coming to you from Treaty 7, the ancestral home of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Iythkastoni Nakota nations of Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Goodstoney bands, the people of the Tsuut'ina Nation, and Métis people of Region 3 who call Treaty 7 their home. So we have a rich Indigenous history too, and excited to talk a little bit about what that looks like as we continue our conversation. But as I think about sort of what we're seeing in Calgary, there are really 3 things that I want to highlight. The first is a big conversation and challenge around affordability. Similar to in Halifax, we just came out of last week, 3 full days of conversation about affordable housing at City Committee and Council. Again, very emotional pleas and stories from over 162 Calgarians who were talking about their challenges of living in this city. That was the result of this big housing strategy that was proposed by administration, where we learned that over 100,000 Calgarians are at high risk of losing their housing. And this is partly because of that success of so many people coming to this city and the impacts and the pressures that places. So there really is a national conversation, I think, to be had around housing. And it is a housing crisis. And the reason it's important to talk about that, because it has an impact on libraries and public spaces. We're also seeing that sort of exacerbation of inflation, affordability, mental health, and addiction. These challenges have continued post-pandemic, and we're seeing things particularly at our central library, but increasingly out in communities around Calgary, where it comes to more social disorder, open drug use, erratic and sometimes violent behavior, and we're also starting to see the impact of encampments here. And I have to say that although the library continues to coordinate and collaborate with other agencies, levels of government, community organizations, we know that lots more needs to be done. And I saw Mark Garner shout out a hello on the chat. He's the head of our Calgary Downtown Association. And collaboration and partnership is something that we think about all the time that is going to be a part of the solution and a critical part of the solution. And some of what we're seeing has a direct impact on the library. We have our highest use of the library that we ever have in our 110-year history. So over 750,000 people in Calgary are active library members, which is over 57% of Calgarians. We saw over 1.1 million visitors to our locations in July and August alone. And we see an average of 20,000 visitors a day to our locations. And I mentioned that 3,000 to 4,000 at our central library. So, I mean, what I see as encouraging is that the library is stepping up and being that resource, and our community is utilizing us. It's for information, it's for job support, upskilling and micro-credentialing, free tutoring for their kids and support for youth. We're becoming, 10 years ago, we were trying to get teenagers into libraries, and now they're coming in droves, and we're working in partnership to do that. Sometimes libraries are a place just for folks to stay warm or cold, depending on the Wi-Fi, the weather, whether it's hot in the summer or cold in the winter. We are a resource and an emergency place for people to come. And then when I think about digital literacy, you know, when you think about affordability and you think about poverty, you think about access to things that are necessities, but really challenging when you're trying to make a decision between paying for housing and rent or paying for food. You know, that internet bill might not be something you can afford. So coming to the library for access to Wi-Fi, computers, free printing, even those things to help you, those resources to help you find the next place to rent. Libraries are here to help, but we can't do it alone. And so that's why collaboration becomes that sort of rallying cry for us in Calgary in working with other organizations, institutions, and levels of government to respond to what we're seeing on the ground. Because I always say that, you know, public libraries are a bit of a bellwether. We see everything that's happening in community and we can reflect it back to other organizations and levels of government, because we're unique in how many people we see daily in all different circumstances who feel welcome and that they belong at the library.
I mean, I think that's the question, is this notion of belonging. Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to encourage everybody to put their cameras on and open your mics, because unless you've got a marching band behind you, I'm not worried about sound traveling. It's better that we just have as many of us on the chat as we can. It's interesting, you know, what's that expression? If you have a hammer, everything's a nail. You know that expression? I feel this is what's happening in the discourse at the moment, that everything's about housing. And I am a little concerned about that, because obviously we're in a housing crisis, but we're in a gazillion other crises at the same time. And I worry that we forget that there's no one solution, and you can't just solve one thing. So someone in the chat has asked this, has said, what would a streamlined, I'm just going to read it. What would a streamlined approach to working on precarious housing between the city, province, and federal government, short-term and long-term, look like? And part of me wants to say, we need a streamlined approach to problem solving on every aspect of what these folks are reporting. We need some kind of way to have those kinds of conversations about a series of issues. So Bill, if I go back to you in terms of your role as a municipal administrator, how could we learn from this extraordinary period we've had, and we're still having, where a whole bunch of things are a confluence together? How do we have a new conversation with the other orders of government to solve whatever the challenge is? What do you think?
I think the first thing is getting people around the table. I mean, it's the structures that we have built over decades are siloed. So yeah. Housing, mental health, addictions, crime, and in many cases, the policy positions, for very, very, very great intentions, policies are being taken, policy positions are being taken based on a singular view of the issue. And yeah. I guess I would ask is that if we take a half a step back and put our policy suggestions on the table, and then look at them not only from those other dimensions, crime, because inadvertently we could be making decisions that are actually causing a backfire effect and a negative outcome in another area, not doing it purposely, but just because we haven't asked the question. And then I think the other piece that we need to do, and I call these lenses, and these are kind of spread out through our public safety strategy, but we need to be very, very aware that, again, going to my previous comment, one size does not fit all. So in our case, what does this look like from an Indigenous view? What does this look like from an African Nova Scotia view? What does this look like from a youth view, a seniors view, a 2SL LGBTQ plus view, a business view? And I think having that broad-based conversation around it will go a long way, because I think there's a lot of people that want to do good work. I think sometimes our structure is getting in the way of us actually doing that. So, and I respect the levels of government and all, but I think it's important from a person that does the work that I'm doing is, I'll leave the argument between governments to the political officials. My role is to make things better. And that means rolling up my sleeves and working with whoever I need to work with to try to move this thing ahead. And I think that's fundamentally, and I'm seeing some positive pieces coming out of this. There was a time when people were very polarized in their positioning. And don't get me wrong, there's still very polarized opinions which are driving some of the problems. But I think there was a lot more people willing to come to the table and have a broader based discussion on as you said, the problems, as opposed to the singular problem that they may have a primary requirement. They're looking at it in a much more holistic, comprehensive way.
I mean, it's interesting, the concept of empathy. Somebody said that early on in the sessions, that, we need to have empathy for people. I always now want to say, well, how do we go from empathy to solutions? I worry that Canadians, that empathy is our version of whatever the Americans say, thoughts and prayers, and then they don't actually do anything. So that's the fun. Sue, I'm kind of gobsmacked that you guys have had navigators since when? 2008, did you say?
2007.
So you've had 16 years of this brilliant concept of a business improvement area, having somebody who's a social worker whose job it is to identify people that are at risk. I've told this anecdote before in CityTalk that the transit system in Toronto is in rupture state, and they, for a period of time, have put people out on the street with little pennies. I want to bring pennies back, little penny, and I can identify them. I can walk up to them and say, I have to get to such and such a place, and that person tells me how to do it. They help me navigate. And I feel like librarians and library staff are navigators. This is a beautiful concept of people helping other people. So when you have tried to break down these silos to deal with the business challenges, what's your experience been? How have you been able to do it?
Yeah, to be frank, Mary, it's not been a good experience, because we have this infighting with these levels of government. As you said, the federal government says, oh, no, we gave the money to you, the province. And the province is like, well, that's your municipal park, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, to give an example, when we were looking for campsites, so Max Chauvin, who heads up our housing and homelessness, the province offered him 2 sites. One was a toxic waste dump that a chemical dry cleaner was on, and they were like, "Oh, gee, sorry, yeah, that we can't use
That
that."
won't work.
And the other one was outside the city in a ravine. Like, you need to have access where people can have access to water, power, transit, and to be local, right? They want to be, you know, the reason that they're in Victoria Park for a reason. The people of Spring Garden Road
Right.
are very generous. No, nobody's going to go without breakfast. Nobody's not going to have a coffee. You know, the hats that we work with the library, you know, for the annual drop box for socks and coats and mitts and all of those things. But as Bill said, it's the overall lack of coordination. So you could have one individual on the street who knows the system and has now gotten 3 sets of socks or 5 this, and he's got his bus tickets. You know, I gave him 10 bus tickets today. Somebody else gave him bus tickets. So that overall, like in our first meeting with Bill, I was like, can someone just give me the big playbook? You know, the overall reaching chart. And I think this is the beginning of it. But again, you know, you need that level of cooperation. So the first level of cooperation is that's your provincial land. Okay, I'm going to put my tiny homes on your provincial land at, let's say it was Point Pleasant Park. It's got all the access, it's got access. So those conversations need to happen. And those that can make the decisions at the top need to start moving a lot faster. As our premier said, yeah, we're coming out with a homeless strategy in November. Well,
Yeah.
what do I tell the 80-year-old man or the family living in Victoria Park? Hang on, November's coming. And we already know that through COVID, a lot of this was shuffled in quietly. You know, taxpayers weren't aware of this, that, you know, we had people at risk, vulnerable, they were living in hotels. It was not a good experience for the hotels. And as Bill can tell you, a lot of these hotels, it doesn't matter. They're not going to buy into that program because,
Yeah.
you know, COVID's over to most people. People want to travel. The hotels are at 85% capacity. They can't put any more in because they don't have the staffing, right? So where does that next level fall to? I need breakfast, right? So it also falls, the other institution is the churches. You know,
Yeah.
some of the churches have very, you know, have always stepped up. St. Mary's Basilica has always had a hot lunch program. St. Matthew's on Barrington Street. It looks like it'll be our daytime drop-in shelter if we can. But it's the resources that are missing, and especially in the mental health area, there's no coordination there to my knowledge at this point.
You know, we just have to remind ourselves, a hotel is not a community.
Mhm.
And so, you know, there was that tendency, oh, great, they're in hotels. Well, for crying out loud, you know, a hotel is not a community. Those of us that spend too much time in them can tell you that. So if what I'm hearing from you folks is we need on the ground solutions that are coordinated with other orders of government, we're back to the title of this session, which is how do we strengthen civic institutions? And how do we prepare for whatever not only is, oh, so you made this point, it's not just people that are experiencing homelessness. There's all sorts of a range of vulnerability. And then there's people that might not identify as vulnerable, but have a vulnerability. I mean, we all do. So we all need these institutions. So I'm wondering, as we move forward, let me just hear from Sarah and Osa as 2 stewards of these civic institutions. What do you see as the future in terms of resourcing, how you want to structure yourselves? What do you think? Osa first, then Sarah.
Yeah. Well, I think, Mary, you and I have talked often about sort of the evolution of public libraries, and certainly COVID really signaled that libraries are actually super well positioned to shift and to shape shift and morph to where the community needs us to be. Certainly, we can't do that without more resources, but I would argue on a regular basis, we are the front door for the federal government, helping folks with their taxes, helping them, you know, apply for CERB, understanding what they need to pay back and how to do that. And, you know, the federal government doesn't have storefronts anymore. We're the storefront for the provincial government. Folks are coming in. In fact, we're partnering in really interesting ways, having ID clinics, right? Without a piece of identification, many of our most vulnerable can't access other
Can't even
services.
get it. Yeah.
So, you know, the team from Service Nova Scotia drops in, brings technology, and they're well set up to do that work. So coming to where the people are, whether that's an immunization clinic or an ID clinic.
So do we need more of you? I mean, this is, you know,
I would say yes. I would say more
it's
of
like-
us for more hours.
Yeah, library. It's libraries as storefronts. It's libraries as living rooms. It's all components of. I went to the National Arts Centre last week to meet with their director. He was saying that his predecessor, Peter Herndorf, when they redesigned the National Arts Centre in Ottawa, said that he wanted it to be Ottawa's living room. And sure enough, it had, you know, their area had a resemblance to your public spaces now. So it's not just you. I worry a little bit that we say, let the library do it, you know. Can you form partnerships with other folks? How do we create more of you?
Yeah, of course we can, Mary. And I think Sarah alluded to our partnerships that we all have locally in many ways, right? We're the great sharing infrastructure. So what should our community be sharing? We've already got the checking in, checking out system. Like those are natural connections. In fact, some libraries in rural Nova Scotia are hosting virtual doctor's appointments for folks who can't get to a family doctor and are trying to use technology to access a doctor's appointment. And it's often the technology is the barrier. So I think there's plenty that we can do. I think there are some things we shouldn't do. Right. And I think we need to temper this. We are open and flexible and want to be that natural place people land to for help. But we are not addictions counselors. We are not primary mental health care services. So we can triage folks to that work, but we need somebody to triage too. And so when I think we can't be the replacement for solving other issues that need more resources as well.
I think this is the dilemma, you know, that phrase, you need something, don't give it to a busy person. But I feel like libraries become that, just give it to the library. But Sue, same for you. Like you did this great job. You created these navigation systems. You've got highly overperforming, over-functioning business improvement areas, basically. And we're back then to, well, if not you folks, then who? Sarah, how are you folks? How do you actually engage other civic institutions then? And Bill needs more allies. Can't all be the libraries or the BIAs. Sarah.
For sure. I mean, I think this piece that Osa mentioned of focusing on what we're good at. We're really good as libraries as creating spaces where everyone belongs and everyone's welcome. We have an amazing amount of collections and resources to help guide people through the things that they're struggling with, but also the things that they want to achieve. We have great programming, but it also comes down to partnerships. One of the things that's been really successful for us is working with different partners. We have newcomer serving agencies that have space in many of our libraries to provide settlement services directly in locations. We have a wellness desk where we have social workers who are experts in that work come in, and they have space in our library locations to do single session counseling and meet one-on-one with folks. This idea of being a space and a resource that, you know, is across so many communities, that is open so many hours. And as Osa said, there's always opportunity to increase that's how we can support other organizations and also stay true to what we are. And I think it's important, this piece of us responding to community needs, but remembering that one of the things that libraries do really well is look upstream and create better conditions for the future. And that's where that focus on early literacy, that focus on getting kids ready for school, that focus on supporting children and families, you know, through the school system and supporting youth to see a future for themselves. Those are really critical things that libraries do. And you're right, Mary. I sometimes think there is this tendency to say, well, libraries have the infrastructure, libraries have the space, libraries have fantastic, well-trained staff. They can take on all of these pieces, but we need to stay true to what we do, which is both that upstream and that responsive. Because if we don't, we're putting future generations at risk. So I think a lot about how we support our staff, our volunteers, you know, to support the patrons who we're seeing coming through our doors, but it has to come down to collaboration and working with other orders of government and other agencies to say, hey, we see a community need. How can you come into our spaces? How can our infrastructure support you in serving these community needs?
You know, Bill, it all comes back to you, Bill. You know, the dilemma is, it's hard to not take a gender lens to this, just saying. because so many library systems are run by women. I know there are library systems run by men in Canada, but it's and the notion of community stewardship too. A lot of BIAs run by women. Just saying. But Bill, when you look to the kind of battalion of supports you've got available to you to provide this on the ground support, what do you need? You're running out of money. We read the papers. Municipal governments have less and less money available. Your transit systems are bleeding, etc. Can we create something new? What do you think?
I was as I was listening to Sarah speak there and Nosa speak, I was looking down my list of social determinants of health.
Yeah.
And I was trying to figure out, okay, number one, can we actually put who's doing the work on these against each one of those determinants? And then the next question is do they know, does the left hand know what the right hand is? Do they, are we talking between people? There's, do we need more money? I'm not sure. We can throw money at this thing, but I would much rather take a half a step back and say, okay, is there a way that we can better organize ourselves so that we are starting to fill in the gaps? And then if we look at those together, and then look at it and then say, okay, what's working well? Great, let's continue to support those, but where are the gaps? And I think if we're going to talk about new money, I'd like to put it down to say, number one is, if we've got, for instance, 6 agencies doing the same thing, can we not look and say, maybe one of those agencies could maybe move or shift a tiny bit to help fill the gap that's here in the comprehensive, support system? If we think about a wraparound service for community, that's about providing the right mixture. Number one, having the ability to access those supports, but then looking at the issue and then providing, it's almost like baking a cake. You need a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but if I want to make a different meal, I may need a lot of this over here and this over here. And having the flexibility and the nimbleness to be able to have those things in play. It's not struck on me, and I mentioned this, my background was in policing, but it's not lost on me that the things that are open to people on a regular basis, libraries, emergency departments, and police departments, those are the ones that will in most cases that are open for people to walk into. And I think we need to fundamentally, especially for those that are experiencing most vulnerable, the navigator concept. Let's face it, it's difficult for me, and I think of myself as a pretty switched on person, to navigate some programming and how do I move through things. Imagine if I had additional vulnerabilities, don't have access to Wi-Fi. How are our most vulnerable trying to interact with some of these programs? So I think we need to take it to the streets, take it to the individuals, and do it in a much more open and collaborative fashion. Before I ask for any more money, that's what I would say. Are we able to make it better with what we have? And then use that evidence then to formulate a case, as opposed to saying, give me the money and I'll fix it. No,
money is not,
Yeah.
I know it's not always about money, but sorry, it's also about power, and I was losing power, so I had to move over in the kitchen here to a power supply. So if you look at the Business Improvement Association form of organizing, which I think is about 50 years old, right? And it came out of Toronto, I think. And it's called different things, business improvement districts, business improvement zones. It's proliferated everywhere. It's a beautiful concept, though, of a collective voluntary group getting together to focus on an aspect of a place, right? Do we need to morph that into some new kind of model, which would be like, I don't know if anybody from Edmonton's on the line here. They have community leagues that have been around for a century. Don't know if they have a higher functioning, but just this idea that we would have a network of community minders, whatever we call them, and that, as Bill suggests, there'd be some kind of coordinated impetus, and then the libraries would be part of it, and so would the businesses, and then that entity would become the chief steward and determiner of priorities. Has anybody ever talked about that BIA 2.0?
Yeah, actually, Mary, we had a lot of discussions on it. The reality is, a police officer might only have 12 to 20 hours of mental health training. Wouldn't it be great on a call, when we know it's a mental health call, that somebody's there from mental health and somebody's there from social services to assist this police officer? Because the reality is, no social worker, no navigator is going to go into a dangerous situation without the officer. right? So if they can compartmentalize and start doing these teams. So, you know, my dream is to have a community safety office in the library, so that, you know, the support services for regional police are there, but then to have every Friday the mobile mental health unit or the mobile mental health clinic that comes to Spring Garden in the area. So the services, as we've all stated, the services come to the streets, not the streets being engaged. And, you know, I think everyone has said it's the 4 determinants of health. You know, from a business perspective, they're like, you know what, enough's enough. I'm sick of the needle damage. I'm sick of feces in my doorway. So the addict, you know, it's just basically they're tired, right? They don't have enough staff. They're running 50, 60 hours a week. They've got the pressure of the loans coming due. And then this new social determinant. And my fear is in Halifax, you know, the West is the leader kind of in this whole issue. And I don't think that we're learning. I don't know. Some days I just feel that we're doomed to repeat it, right? Everyone's just going to keep spinning on the wheel until somebody said, oh my God, get onto this wheel over here and we'll see. But I'm cautiously optimistic about the new levels of communication that I'm seeing, just to even have the navigators meet each other in the province, right? So, you know,
Or in the,
again, we're 10 times the size of Edmonton. It's huge.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, it's interesting. I feel like that's what the COI's business is. We're in the connective tissue business to help us learn from each other across the country, and also to continue to highlight for other orders of government just how important it is to learn on the ground. In terms of learning opportunities, I'll just put a plug in here. I can see Evergreen's put in the 16th of October. They're having a thing at the end of November. COI, with all of you that are partnering with us, many across the country are partnering on a big national convening called At the Crossroads, where we really want to highlight what's working and what's not and what needs to be next for Canada's urban regions and smaller communities as well. And one of the people coming to speak there is Seth Kaplan. Google him, folks. He's written a book that's going to come out called Fragile Neighborhoods. This is a guy who looked at states and wrote about fragile states, and then suddenly has decided, oh, it's actually about neighborhoods. So we're all moving in this direction about more local autonomy, more local power, more local resources. How do we go local in every aspect of what we're doing? So just as a parting comment, can each of you just offer a sentence or two about that piece, the focus that we were determining here about our role upstream? What did you call it, Sarah? Upstream and in-stream, I guess, around the social determinants of health and the role of civic institutions. First, a couple sentences from you, Osa, then Sue, Bill, and then Sarah.
Well, Mary, I love that you talked about local. I think you know, I often talk about people bumping into one another at public spaces where everyone is welcome, and the beautiful things that can come from that. That can be a deeper understanding of that person. It's a humanizing of the other. It can be different perspectives across all ages. If we can get that local connecting, while we can solve problems much better. And you know, I'm mindful of Sue's comment. You know, we need our civic spaces to still feel welcoming and safe for all, and that is part of the solution to solving the issues that we're facing in the moment and preventing bigger issues a generation from now. So that welcoming all is critical.
Yeah, welcoming and inclusion and being open. Quickly, one sentence from you, Sue.
Yeah, communication. That's it in 5 seconds.
Yeah. Bill.
If we don't look at the traumas being experienced by people now, we will repeat what we're going to be seeing into the future. Fundamentally, we need to stop and stop the cycle.
Cautionary tale. Yeah. Sarah.
It's about learning the real, what's really happening from the people that are experiencing it. I'm echoing Bill. There's not a blanket solution. It needs to be individualized. It needs to be culturally sensitive. We need to understand who we're trying to serve and really come around together around what the problem that we're trying to solve and who those people are. But that comes down to collaboration. So echoing Sue, collaboration, communication.
Honestly, you guys are great. Thank you so much for joining us. We've had some of you on before. It's, you know, this, we always say at CityTalk, it's not the end of the conversation, it's just the beginning. Some of us will go back into the hall here and continue with the art of city building. A couple of plugs. One is that we're great partners with the Livable Cities Forum next week, which is in Toronto, that ICLEI is doing. We published today a report called Halifax Evolves that we did with a lot of partners here. Please go and you'll see it's in the chat. It's a work in progress, part of our CUI local program about this community and its aspirations and how it thinks it's doing. And as I suggested, November 30, State of the Cities. And then on October 16, we'll be back with you to talk about civic institutions and libraries at the Evergreen Conference, also linked in the chat. Thanks, guys. Really great to see you. Really, thank you for joining us.
Mary.
Thanks for putting up with the technical glitches, audience. Thanks.